Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's CAP Project Echo session. We're going to be talking about early childhood mental health. We're really glad to see all of you here today. And if we could go on to the next slide. As you're coming in, go ahead and drop into the chat your name, your organization, the county you're in, just so we know who's here. Let's go ahead and drop that in as you're coming in. And for those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Joanne Jung. I'm a general pediatrician here at UCSF. I practice in San Francisco. And I know if you're like me, we're either rushing from clinic or from some other meetings or any other kinds of our busy packed mornings. I just want to take a moment for us to try and ground ourselves just a little bit. Let's take a moment, close your eyes if you would like. Take a couple of good deep breaths, just on your own time. One or two more breaths. A moment to stretch if you need to. Kind of shake off whatever it is that we're carrying in from this morning or from yesterday. And okay, if you can just go ahead and launch the Zoom poll. It's also an opportunity for us to check in with ourselves and say, how am I doing today? What am I bringing here with me? Just go ahead and take a moment to answer that poll question. And if you're just coming in and you haven't had a chance to drop a quick intro into the chat, please do. Just your name, your organization, what county you're in, so we have some idea of who's here. Thanks for doing that. So far, it looks like most of us are seeing a little bit of stress here, but not a crazy amount, which is great. Which is great to see. And so, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and sharing results with folks as we finish dropping our introductions into the chat. Like, some of us here are bringing some stress. Maybe not the worst manifestations of it, which is great. Okay. Right. So with that, welcome again, everybody. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide as we go into some introductions. Announcements. So we're going to be recording the didactic portion, so just be aware of that. It'd be great to turn your cameras on, especially during the case discussion portion of the session, so we can see each other. Looks like we're a bit of a smaller group today. And wherever we're coming in from, all around California, just be good to see each other as we're sharing and talking. Let me know if you're interested in sharing a case for our next session. And this is our way of getting American Board of Pediatrics MOC Part 2 credit, is by thinking about a case to share and sharing it with our group. And so let me know if you're interested in sharing a case. I believe our next session, I can't remember offhand, maybe that's something that May can drop into the chat for us later. But let me know if you've got cases to share either in May or in June, because we have 2 months left in this cohort. Another encouragement is ECHO really is designed to help us all come together and support each other around patient care questions that are puzzling us. And this is a great chance to do it. But in the meanwhile, calling CAP, now called CAP, is another great way to get some support around those questions that are really puzzling us or maybe even keeping us up, and to help build some confidence around this. You can call psychiatrists, pretty soon, I think you can also call our psychologists as well for their view on diagnosis, themes, patient engagement tips, and all of this. So want to make sure that you're aware of all the different kinds of support that are available to us. Next slide, please. Quick look at our disclosures and our sources of funding. No major financial disclosures for any of us who are involved in organizing or delivering the session today, but we do have these federal and state sources of funding. And with that, let's go to the next slide. And I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. We're very lucky to have with us Sally Cantrell, who is a licensed clinical psychologist with a background in public health research. She specializes in the mental health and developmental needs of infants through early childhood, offering consultations for children ages 0 to 7, often using a home visiting model. She provides assessment for children with mental health and neurodevelopmental disorders, as well as ongoing treatment for infants, toddlers, and young children. She's trained in the Fussy Baby model, trauma-informed child-parent psychotherapy, and circle of security parenting interventions. Over the last decade, she has offered parent groups for families involved in the child welfare system, as well as families whose children are eligible for regional center services due to developmental delay. She also works closely with and advocates for the needs of children and Spanish-speaking immigrant families, at times volunteering to do asylum evaluations for children. Outside of work, Sally practices martial arts, enjoys running in our regional parks, and loves to eat at taco trucks around the Bay Area. With that, turning the virtual mic over to Sally.
Thank you, Joanne. And thank you to everyone else who has made time and space on what looks, at least here, like a beautiful spring day to focus in on early childhood mental health. And it's a subject that I care a lot about. And I think I'll just start by saying when we think about early childhood mental health, a lot of people age up in their minds. We know people tend to think about children 4, 5, and 6. But today I'm going to try to draw us backwards into those early years of sort of 0, 1, 2, and 3. Mental health even starts in utero. So today in my talk, I'm going to be focusing on these fundamental concepts of relationships and place, but I'm also going to try to offer you a model that you could use to figure out what's going on when a family presents with a particularly difficult situation or problematic behavior in your office. And then we're going to review some of the classic developmental tasks of early childhood. Next slide. So I like this picture because I like to think of you in your office with your mental health hat on. Here's kind of a Freudian couch. And I know from looking at the American Academy of Pediatrics that you, during well-child visits, have like 11 of them in the first 18 months of life. And so I feel like that really gives you the opportunity to offer a consistent and trusting relationship that unfolds over time and provides the context for these kinds of vulnerable emotional conversations that might need to unfold from one time to another in a young child's life. Next slide. So here I wanted to offer you a definition of early relational health that comes from the Frameworks Institute. And the key here is really that healthy development in young children is really intricately tied to the health of the relationship with their primary caregiver. There's recognition that both the child and the parent are key contributing actors in the relationship. And this concept was really built on a body of literature about attachment that has been unfolding for the past 80 years. And if I were to try to describe attachment in a maybe one sentence, what I would say honestly is that it's the developmental goal of the first year of life and describes a human infant's tendency to seek comfort, support, nurturance, and protection selectively from a small number of caregivers. And it's often hierarchical in nature. Historically, we've been really focused on the mother, but we know that fathers and many different types of caregivers play a very important role, and that there's often more than one person. We also think a lot about attachment equality, and that's related to a caregiver's ability to attend to the child and read their signals and respond appropriately when their attachment system is activated. So when they're uncomfortable or feeling insecure or unsafe for some reason. Next slide. So we know that a picture is often worth so much more than words. And so in addition to enjoying this clip of a baby that I'd say is probably a little less than 6 months, you can tell because she's kind of nestled up in the corner of this chair to give her body some support. So she's probably not sitting independently yet. I'd like you to think about what are the elements that you observe in the relationship that would be meaningful and promoting of a strong start. So if you could go ahead and start this video, thank you.
We got 2 outfits. Yeah. Look, you got some flower pants with the pink shirt, or you could wear the pink pants with the ruffles on the butt, and it's got the love on the shirt. Look at that. It says love. You want to wear that one? Yeah, okay. We'll wear this one today and we'll wear this one tomorrow. Which bow you want to wear? You want to wear the pink? Or you want to wear the tan, a little offset color? Okay, we can go with the tan. I like that. Not too much pink. Okay, girl.
You can pause it there, Michael.
Where you going?
So this video goes on a little longer, and in the end, this caregiver has actually put on an outfit he discovers it's too small, and so they have to do it all over again. But I hope you were able to pick up on aspects of pacing, pausing to leave a little space for the child to respond. This child's gaze is really clearly tracking her caregiver. They've taken an everyday experience of putting on an outfit and made it into a whole thing. It's like a whole experience. And I kind of have the sense, and I hope maybe you do too, that this kid's about to have a really great day because someone's paying really close attention to her, and they're drawn into a shared experience. Let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to give you some thoughts about milestones you can look out for and comment on with parents, and help them think about their child's development. This slide comes from David Willis, who is a pediatrician and promoter of early relational health. And these are the types of images where you can see the types of evolving parent-child relationship interactions that you would expect in the first year of life. And so we expect to see that joint attention, that mutual engagement. We look for serve and return kinds of interactions, or otherwise known as circles of communication, where it goes back and forth between the caregiver and the child over and over and over again. We look for matching of affect, attunement to the other person, and the pacing of the interaction. So with babies, we need to leave a lot of extra time so that they can process and respond. We want to see mutual joy, but we also want to see mirroring of the full range of emotions. We look for mutual initiation between the baby and the caregiver. We look for imitation. Here you can see a caregiver doing a raspberry with the baby. And then as these interactions become more complex, we expect them to be able to work together towards a shared goal, such as reading a book. And parents love it if you point out how these things are coming along. And I think it helps develop like shared curiosity about what's happening in a relationship. Next slide. So I got to thinking this past week about vaccinations as an opportunity to think about relationships. And I realized there's actually a lot of parallels between the experimental design for the strange situation in psychology that's used to classify types of relationships and the sort of interactions that take place in a pediatric well visit. And I was thinking, a family comes in with their child, they enter the waiting room, often there's toys and it's just the two of them or maybe another family there, but it's a low stress situation often. But then someone who's unfamiliar comes in, they bring them to a room, they're isolated, it's an unfamiliar room. stress level goes up a little bit. Then someone who's unfamiliar touches the child. That increases that stress level even further, and ultimately often culminates in vaccinations, which is a painful experience and also stressful. And so in the strange situation, the highest stress level comes when there's actually a separation between the parent and the child. But here you have a different stressor. And so what I wanted to say is that we don't focus so much on the child's reaction to the stressor, but how do they make use of their caregiver to mediate that stress? And so this is another opportunity for you to comment and notice and pay close attention to what you see. Is the child able to make use of their caregiver for co-regulation and to calm? Do they turn to that person? Are they able to use their voice or some sort of soothing mechanism? And to notice that and be like, oh, it seems like you're really able to help comfort that child. And on the contrary, if it seems like a child is, just really overwhelmed and they're having a hard time, I can imagine saying something like, it seems like it's really hard to figure out how to help her calm back down. And I would ask, is this how it normally goes? And then if they said, yes, this is how it normally goes, I might offer, would you maybe want some support in figuring out how to help your child with their big emotions? And then if they say yes, like one of the things that I was thinking is I would suggest that one of the best strategies that we all have for immunizing relationships is really to prescribe play. And by that, I really mean a special time that's set aside between a caregiver and their young child. And it doesn't have to be a huge, long amount of time. I sometimes start with an extremely small amount of time that everyone can imagine doing, like maybe 10 minutes is what you set aside, where you put your phone to one side, you give your unconditional attention to your child. You're not trying to teach them. You're really trying to pay attention to their interests and elaborate those. And so those are sort of the kind of guidelines that I might give for play. And I think that if we can help caregivers and young children stay connected, that's like gotta be the best thing that we can do throughout that early childhood period. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is something that I am getting really excited about, and I wanted to make sure that everyone here also had heard about it. You can go to diversitydatakids.org. This is the Child Opportunity Index, and it's an interactive website that allows you to ask questions about the neighborhoods in which your patients are living, and compare the child opportunity there to a national index of standards. It has data from all 72,000 census tracts in the United States. And there's a wide-ranging number of measures that they're looking at. There's 29 here that you can see that are focused on education, health and environment, and also social and economic. And actually, there's a new version out as of a couple of weeks ago that now has 44 indices. So they're refining this index over time. And when you think about child opportunity here in California, we have some of the highest levels of child opportunity in places like San Francisco and San Jose. We also have places with some of the lowest child opportunity indexes in the Central Valley. And one other concept that I was really interested in from starting to look into this is that different metro areas can be characterized as either resource hoarding or resource sharing. So when you have two neighborhoods, you can look at how much opportunity there is. And if there's a wide difference between two neighborhoods in a metro area, that would be a resource hoarding one. Whereas if there's less of a difference and two neighbors have more or less similar child opportunity index, that would be a resource sharing metro area. Next slide, please. And so why does this matter? Well, this is an example, if you look at this graph on the left, of how children in poor families have higher cortisol levels than children who come from non-poor families. And then if we shift over to the right, we can see that children who are poor, who live in high opportunity areas, actually reap the benefit of lower cortisol. So there's a sort of a dose-dependent response there, and that shows us why these neighborhoods really matter. Next slide. So what's also exciting to me about this data set is how it's starting to drive policy decisions at the state and local level. You guys are probably all familiar, but there's really sort of an epidemic of child expulsions at the preschool level. And we discovered that about 20 years ago with some research, but it's still ongoing, and it's disproportionately high for African-American children, and particularly for African-American boys. And New York took a look at their data, and they saw that kids who were living in Albany, it was actually the worst place for Black kids to live. And while this was shocking, it was also galvanizing for their local leaders, and they decided to try to do something about it. And what they decided to do was to revitalize key parks in the neighborhood and build play structures and adult exercise equipment. And so while you might not think about, parks or being like a major sign of equity, really you need stimulating places for children to grow and to play and for families to interact together. And so this was the step that they took. And so this Child Opportunity Index is really helping target funding and services where they're needed most. And so I hope you guys will find an opportunity to take a look at it and ask questions about where you are. Next slide. All right, so now I wanted to shift us to looking at this model, to thinking about the kinds of problems that may come into your office. And there's so many different types of problems that are worth mentioning, but it's important to think that children communicate through their behavior almost exclusively, and that we really have to be detectives in order to figure out the etiology of what's going on behind that underlying behavior. And so, kids bite, they kick, they hit, there's all kinds of things that happen. But let's take a really simple one, like crying, and think about it from multiple perspectives. So sorry, this is a slide that kind of has things that pop up. If you could get the next one, please. So if we thought about crying from a developmental perspective, often children who have developmental delays with speech use crying as their primary way to communicate. And so we would expect to see more crying in that child. Next one, please. We also think about individual differences. And by that, I'm really thinking about a child's temperament, or maybe even some of their sensory differences. So a child could be more reactive, and we would expect a child who's more reactive to cry more. Next, also thinking about the environment. We can have an environment that is too stimulating for a baby, or perhaps an environment that's really not stimulating enough. So environmental can play a key role. The next one is culture. You can think, there's research that shows that even hunter-gatherer societies that wear their babies all the time, that those kids in comparison to children in Western societies actually cry much less. So we always have to think about cultural variables that may be weighing in. The next one is toxic stress and trauma. And as much as we don't like to think about babies and toddlers experiencing serious stress, babies and young children are exposed to shootings, their parents die, they are involved in fires, and it's really important that we always ask. And sometimes there are even sort of traumas with a lowercase t that impact young children that it's worth attending to as well. And the last one that I wanted to touch base on is unmet emotional needs. And to me, that reminds me that children and parents exist in a dyad, and young children's emotional state or behaviors often reflect the caregiver's wellness. And so by that, I'm thinking about serious depressions or very serious anxiety may show up in the child's presentation. And so I wanted to offer you guys just one example of a complex case where it wasn't easy to sort out etiology. And this was a case of a 3-year-old who was a speaking child of 2 deaf parents. And this child actually presented to us, was referred because of very serious behaviors, huge tantrums. In preschool, she was having trouble. She was touching other kids in a way that was unwanted. And what we came to learn was that this child's, all of her language had been learned from watching the television. And one of the things we discovered was that in a deaf communities, the way you get another person's attention is by actually touching them, which makes so much sense, but that wasn't adaptive in the preschool environment, and it needed to be understood contextually. And so, sorry, I'm noticing that there's a reminder that I have 5 minutes left, so I will pay attention to that. Thank you. And so the other thing was that when this family started to teach this child to sign, a lot of the tantrums started to remit. And so if we had really just focused on tantrums as the issue, we wouldn't have been able to get at the underlying issue for this child, which was actually a communication issue. So this, I hope, will offer you sort of a multi-dimensional way of like approaching a problem with a family. Like, here, let's think about it from this perspective. Let's use this lens to think about it, or yet another. Here we've got, what, 1, 2, 3, 6 lenses. Next slide, please. All right. So I'm going to use the remainder of our time to think about what we describe as normative anxieties that most children encounter and need to work through. And the reason I wanted to share this with you guys is because I often use it as sort of my first line of defense. I think of it as psychoeducation that you can offer to families when they're presenting to you with a concern. And I like to think that if I offer this information and the parent's like, oh, okay, I've got it. I can go back and keep working on this. Then you've got it made. But I also think it's really important if it isn't enough. And if the family says, actually, like, it's so much worse, like, no, you don't get it, that we really have to pay attention to what the family is saying to us. And the fussy baby model would always say that it's our job to see the baby that the parent sees. And so if they come back at the next visit and say this is still an issue, then we need to raise up the bar and offer them an intervention or a additional mental health support on a more regular basis. So next slide. One of the most common normative anxieties of early childhood is separation. Usually for the first 6 months of life, you can pass a baby around pretty easily, but moving into that at the end of that year, they start to show a strong preference for their primary caregiver. The flip side of this is that shows us that attachment is happening in the way that it should be unfolding, but it's still not easy. And kids who experience serious separation anxiety can be so tough. Like, parents can't go to the bathroom by themselves. There's somebody screaming while they're showering. When they're trying to drop them off, it makes them feel terrible. And so I wanted to just share this graph on the left. The vast majority of children fall in that very low bar, lower levels of stress associated with anxiety that you can see on the bottom. I'm sorry, I didn't orient you. The x-axis is the age of a child, running from about 1.5 years to 6 years. The y-axis is the level of stress. So more than 60% sort of have that low level consistent throughout the early years. There's a second group, their profile where it increases a bit up to age 4 and then starts to taper back down. There's another group that represents, maybe 10% that start very high and it falls over time. And then there's this last group of maybe 6 or 7% of kids who have very high, consistent, persistent anxiety. And those are the kids that often go on to develop anxiety disorders, and that we really want to pay close attention to. And we can imagine their caregivers are going to need extra support, and that we want to be wondering. And then, so if I see a kid that's like age 5 and suddenly peaks, then I might be thinking, like, what's going on in their environment that's making them suddenly have a high level of anxiety at this point? Because that wouldn't really fit any of these profiles. And in many cultures, we have ways of supporting children with this anxiety. We have goodbye rituals, we have peekaboo, we have hide and go seek. There's lots of ways to help young children learn to manage and master this fear. Next slide. And I'm sure we're coming to sort of the end. So this fear of losing love is pretty intense for young children between the ages of 18 and 36 months. The most important thing I want to share here really is that toddlers want to please their parents during this period. And that can really be used in the service of socialization, helping them to learn to share, helping them not to, not to take things from other people. But it's also the period where, when parents get angry, it can be pretty overwhelming to young children. And in fact, there was always a story in my family that my brother and I were arguing, and we were close in age, and we were arguing in the back seat. Apparently my dad said, "I'm going to turn around and breathe fire on you." And we went completely silent, and he had to pull over and explain to us that he couldn't actually breathe fire. And so it's also, so we have to be thoughtful about how we communicate with young kids and also let them know that we still love them even when we're angry. Next slide. Yeah, I think, many parents of young children have experienced this, where cutting nails, cutting hair, and even flushing feces down the toilet can feel overwhelming and confusing. Kids fear getting hurt, even getting off balance can be overwhelming for them sometimes. And it's really this fear of body damage, and it doesn't go on forever, but it can be very hard to manage when it occurs around these hygiene issues. Let's go to the next slide. I'm rushing to try to get us to the end, but this is one that, why don't we end on this one? I think this, maybe two more. This is a big one, fear of the unknown. So you can see during this period, the kids are really afraid of darkness, monsters under the bed. They worry when they're in the tub that they may go down the drain. And so things that are pretend seem very, very real. Children's fantasy and reality distinction is not very good yet. And they also have this really immature understanding of cause and effect, and that's largely based on their wishes or fears. And so we have to do a lot of answering questions and listening carefully to these fears and repeatedly answering sometimes the same fear over and over and over again. And let's go to the next slide. This one I also think is important to touch on because it comes up a lot, but it just really shows that there's sort of a normative curve associated with physical aggression. All humans have aggressive tendencies, and children, like others, need help figuring out how to channel it. And it can be really helpful for parents to recognize that when kids are hitting or doing other physical behaviors, they're really just trying to communicate. And often their cognition at that point outpaces their ability to communicate. And so they go with what is fastest. And I saw this in a preschool space just yesterday, I guess. A child wanted the other child out of the ball pit. Was 22 months old, came up and grabbed the other child by their head, like by their ears, to pull them out. And so rather than responding in an angry way, like, we really just want to communicate, oh, you want to say mine, it's your turn, like offer them the language, because as they develop that language, we see a remittance in the physicality. And if we don't see that remitting, then we know, again, let's look more deeply. Let's think about developmental differences. Let's pause there, because I want to make space for this really important case that I got to take a look at. And it's an important part of our time together today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sally, for the great talk.